The M1 Garand rifle. I think the official name was rifle M1 30-06 or something, but everyone knows this. Super famous gun. Another popular gun still to this day in the U.S. for people who target shoot. Okay? Now, how is this similar to the M16? Okay. Well, like I said, after World War I, the idea of having a semi-automatic rifle come up. Now, they already designed the Browning automatic rifle, okay? But that was more, actually the thing, when it was fielded, there were two men. It was a two-man team, and it was a squad automatic weapon. Had a detachable 20-round magazine and 30-06. It's full auto, okay? But it took two guys to operate it and weighed almost 19, almost 20 pounds, okay? So, not exactly standard infantry weapon. Now, the problem that everyone had in making a semi-automatic rifle at that time is doing it using like 30-06 to 8mm or any standard military issued round, which was standard for the time. It was almost impossible. You'd have a huge gun, okay? Garand was a Canadian-born designer that worked for us, and in the 30s he started developing this rifle. Now originally, and this is where it also ties into the M16, originally there was another caliber that he was going to build this gun around. And this is how the story all kind of ties in. The British, prior to World War I, developed a 280 or 270 cartridge. And the idea was to have a slightly smaller cartridge comparable to the 30-06. In other words, the bullet and the size of the bullet was a little bit smaller. Instead of 150 or 160 grain, it would be like a 130 grain bullet, a little bit smaller in diameter, instead of 308, 280, 270. More or less, you were just scaling back the cartridge. And the people who calculate ballistics, and this is where it ties in to the AR-15 when they say it should be a different caliber, where they come up with the 6.8 special purpose round. Is these guys did the math, crunched the numbers, and said, in that weapon, in that platform, this is a cartridge. They developed a cartridge. And it's eerily familiar to these cartridges that people have been kicking around for almost 100 years. The 280, 270. So, it was probably a cartridge with less power. So then that means everything can be scaled down and made pretty petite. And this is where the military comes in. Again, much like the AR-15, M16. Douglas MacArthur at the time was still a high-ranking general and had some big position with the U.S. Army. And he said, I don't care what type of weapon you develop, as long as that weapon fires the 30-06 cartridge. Which kind of made the development of this gun, if it was developed in a smaller, a little bit less powerful cartridge, could have made a different type of weapon. But Garand did an excellent job. Okay, he made a gun that's not too huge, not too bulky. Okay, by modern standards, this thing's a clunker, but it functions and it works. So he made the gun. Now, the only two big modifications, or two modifications from when the gun was adopted and its service life, is this gas block up here. The original design, called a mousetrap gas block, they didn't like it, something about it. It was changed, and all the guns were modified, so there's very few of them in existence. He changed the little gas block on the end, and the sight was changed. The original sights were a little bit different than this here. And they were all upgraded. It was a matter of just taking it off, upgrading it. So, by the time, and it was nice, they developed this in peacetime, took their time, got this gun working right, so there wasn't any big issues of it, in modifying it or any deficiencies. The only deficiencies were his magazine system. He uses an in-block 8-round clip, which was nice because it had 3 more rounds than the standard 5-round bolt-action rifle of the people we'd be up against. The only downside is, once you stick the clip in there and fire it, you can't top off the magazine. If you do eject the clip, then everything flies out, and if you don't have 8 rounds to lock into the clip, you really can't reliably load the weapon. So that was about its one shortcoming. The only thing that cost guys their lives is when this thing was done with the last round, that sheet metal clip would fly out and make a huge pinging noise. So the enemy always knew when your gun was empty. But the workaround to that is you go in teams. If one guy's thing comes out, then he's got a couple buddies standing there when the enemy attacks, he shoots them. Or you keep a couple empty clips in your pocket. You're shooting at somebody, you fire once or twice, throw the clip, make the pinging sound, they expose themselves, and you got them. So the one downfall about it. So like I said, what it did was the caliber thing, which is a controversy that's been going on forever, still with the AR-15, had some drawbacks to it. When you take this apart, it's not, it's fairly simple, but what happens is when you get it apart, there's a little small pin you got to push through, and all these parts and levers and arms in the system for the magazine clip release and that. My grandfather could do it, my father, I did it. You just do it 1,000 times, disassembling and assembling it, you can do it. It's not that difficult, okay? But there's one little pin that goes through and locks the whole mechanism inside here, and it's not captive. If you lose the little pin out in the field or something, you're screwed, okay? A little bit complicated to get apart, okay? Machining wise, difficult to manufacture this thing. A lot of hours, a lot of machine work in this. This is not a gun that you can very easily or inexpensively mass produce. I believe that soldiers were given the option when being discharged, if you wanted to keep the rifle, you can pay the government what they paid for it. When you were mustering out and you come back, they said, hey, you like the gun, you want to keep it, give us the $47 or $54, whatever it costs the government, and you can take the gun home with you. Now you'd say, wow, but even at $47 or whatever the amount was, my grandfather told me as a PFC with overseas pay, combat pay, and everything else, the Army paid him $33 a month. So it was kind of like a month and a half pay for the rifle. Now, any of you boys out there in the Army, I remember my buddy back in the 80s was in the Army, they gave you a readout of your equipment and the cost of the government, so if you lost it, sold it, or gambled it away, that's what they're going to take out of your check. And I forget whether an M16 A1 was listed on his loadout. It was kind of like $200 and some, and a PFC or an E3 at the time, 1982, we made about six and a half, say anywhere from 650 to 700 a month. Okay, so now you see where at the time a PFC, this gun cost the government a month and a half pay, where by the time the 80s, the M16 and what the government was paying for them, say cost half a month's pay. To give you a perspective on cost and that. See, that's the thing about this. These things were expensive. Okay? So, the government made a bunch of them. They had them. We kept them in service. They're a good rifle. They're a great rifle to shoot. And like I said, they're still used in competition today. As competition guns in the military rifle. If you go and compete, you can get match grade built Garands done. There's several companies that make them. This weapon is still popular to this very day, okay? Reliable and good. Had a few drawbacks, you know, that if we look at modern warfare, you know, they'd be serious drawbacks now. But, all right, gun. So, now the government, and this is where the controversy comes in again, and where this also ties in with the AR-15 platform. We're going to roll the clock back to when I was a teenager, say to 1975. Now, by now, the M1 Garand, you know, we had the M14, we got the M16 A1, all right? The government's got a pile of these. And what they did is they had a bunch of these guns. We made them in World War II, and when they were thinking of adopting them or reworking the guns from the war, they ran short and they actually produced more in the 50s during the Korean War. So the government had a ton of these guns. Now most of them were disposed of by giving them away as foreign aid. Okay, the Dutch, Colombians or something, they brought a bunch of these in the 90s and we gave Colombia a pile of them. We gave these to the Greeks, and that's where a lot of the guns you get from the CMP are the old reserves that the Greeks have held on. Someone said that they were going to bring in a few thousand of these that the South Koreans had a few years ago, which that deal didn't go through, the last stockpile of U.S. Garands. And this is where it shares the thing with the AR-15. I remember that the government had a pile of these back in the 70s. And they said, look, what are we going to do? We've given away all we can. They're sitting here. It's money. We should sell them. And the government did sell firearms. Okay, M1 Garands, the M1 carbine was sold, 45 pistols. And the government always did liquidate its old guns by selling them from the time of the Civil War. At one time, you could buy black powder muskets, the 30-40 Krag. You just ordered it from the government. You mailed them a check or something, sent them money, they put it in a box, sent it to your house. That's the way it was done for years. And like I said, at the end of the war, you were allowed to buy these. Okay, if you wanted to buy your rifle, you could buy it, or you could buy them from the government for a time. Well, not so much these, because they were still in use. But any gun that was past its prime was usually sold to civilians. Now back in this about 75, and any of you that can remember, the government had a pile of these. And the reason they didn't sell them outright anymore, and the reason that we have the Gun Control Act of 1968 goes back to the 60s. There was a lot of political turmoil, okay? And with President Kennedy's assassination, there was a lot of political intrigue and what we were doing with foreign policy and that. And there was a lot of people that believed that the government was going the wrong way. And there were plots to overthrow the government. This is true. This is not a conspiracy thing. A retired Army general was going around buying up stocks of weapons and that, and somewhere out in the desert outside of Los Angeles, he had a cache of weapons that he was buying from the government, and he was organizing a coup to overthrow the U.S. government. Okay, and that is a true story, and that's one of the reasons why they stopped the sale, the U.S. government stopped the sale to civilians of weapons, and that's why we have to have the Gun Control Act of 1968. You have to remember, there was President Kennedy's assassination, his brother Robert's assassination, Martin Luther King was assassinated, the guy that was the head of the American Nazi Party was assassinated. So people wanted change, public opinion. All right, you get the gun control. The government can no longer sell its ex-military weapons to the public unless you were, again, you had to go into the was called the DCM back then, Director of Civilian Marksmanship. These guns were given away or given to clubs, and if you were a member of a club and was in a rifle shooting program, okay, you could order a rifle. Now that came when I got this one through the CMP, which is a Civilian Marksmanship Program. I belonged to a club that was affiliated with shooting, or did the national military shooting, and I was an honorable veteran, so I was able, without having to go down and actually shoot, join a team and show records, they had a thing to where I could go and get this just because I was a veteran, and that's how I got this gun. This was through the CMP. I had several other different ones over the years of varying quality, but this is the one I kept. Now, the reason they did that is they wanted just to sell the guns like the old days. And this is the big controversy. They wanted to just sell them. And the politicians and that are going, oh, no, no, no. And people said this is a combat weapon. I remember somebody discussing that when I was about 16 or 17 years old. The government shouldn't sell the M1 Garand to people. He goes, you can't hunt with it. You know, military jacketed bullets and that, and 8 rounds, you can't hunt with it. He goes, it shouldn't be in the hands of civilians. And this caused an uproar back then. Okay, they wouldn't allow them out, because I guess not enough people were in the program requesting the guns. I know a lot of guys that did. Any club, they go up and shoot a bit. I know several guys, they got Garands and carbines, but they wanted to sell them. And the general consensus was the government is not selling these assault weapons, military weapons to the general public just freely without no restriction. Okay? That's where, like I said, about 40 years ago, this thing shares another thing with the AR-15, M16. People, the general public, had the consensus that just haphazardly selling these openly to the general public was a bad idea. This was a military-grade weapon that should not be in the hands of civilians. Of course, at that time, this is still pretty good modern technology. You know, if you know how to shoot one of these and there was tons of surplus ammo over, yeah, if you were going to overthrow the government or start a coup, this was the thing, you know. But that's where it shares the same thing. That was the general public consensus. We're not selling the guns, okay? So what happened, and an interesting story was these guns are this, I don't know where they came from. There was a bunch of them. They didn't know how to dispose of them. So time went on, I got out of high school, I got a job and that, and then I joined the Navy. Now, back it was 1982 in the spring. I remember. I joined the Navy, I went into boot camp, and we're getting cycled through. And after a month or so, I had to do a week, they call it service week. You either work in the mess hall, or you do something, they make you do something for a week there, more or less, to pay the government back. You do some maintenance, or you do, it's how they rotate us around. Because I guess the mess hall staff and everything, the people serving food and doing this stuff, weren't permanently assigned. So they sent me to the rec hall or exercise thing, which was a 1/4-mile track indoors of this giant building. And that's where we had to do our PT, because up there in Chicago, Great Lakes, in the wintertime, how are you going to run in the snow? So you had an indoor 1/4-mile track. So they sent me there for a week. I was there, I think there was 8 or 10 of us in there. We had to stay in the building. They had a little bunk area and that. And then we did everything, start guard duty, turn the lights off and that when everybody got done exercising or using the equipment. And I, you know, made sure everything was working and stayed there. So in the middle of this week, the government decided what they were going to do with them M1 Garand rifles, and this is where I seen them again, is weld them up, turn them into drill rifles. And I was there when the big controversial M1 Garand batch came in, and they delivered them to that hall because it was humongous. They could drive the truck in and unload them. And they had all them M1 Garands there, and they were in nice condition too, welded shut, turned into drill rifles. And then the new recruits that came in from that point on were issued one of these, and they had to put a sling on them and hang them on the end of their bunks. And everywhere you went, you marched with an M1 Garand. Gave you a little extra workout. Used to have to be able to do, then again, to do this stuff just like back in the old days. Old school again. Whatever happened to those guns, or if they're still there, Great Lakes, I don't know. But that's where I seen the end of the controversy. They're turned into drill rifles. I missed that by 2 months. I didn't have to lug one around or carry it or march. And I guess they all had to learn the manual of arms and shit again, which I didn't have to do that at the time. But that's what happened to them. So that's the story of the M1 Garand and its similarity and how it's tied in to the AR-15 platform.